The moment my mother-in-law looked me in the eye and said, "A real woman supports her husband's family first," I understood something I had spent 4 years refusing to believe. She wasn't going to change. And neither was my husband. Not unless I gave him a reason to. What happened next, nobody in that house saw coming. Least of all me. My name is Nora, and I was 31 years old when I finally stopped apologizing for existing. I had been married to my husband for 4 years. We had a daughter named Ivy, who had just turned 2, a small townhouse in Oakville, Ontario, and what I used to describe, to friends, to my mother, to myself, as a good life, stable, comfortable, mostly happy, mostly. My husband's name is Kevin. He's the kind of man who fixes things without being asked, who remembers to fill the gas tank when it's running low, who never once forgot an anniversary or a birthday. On paper, he was everything. And in the daily life we built together, he genuinely was a kind person. Patient with Ivy, generous with his time, funny in the quiet, dry way that made me fall in love with him in the first place. But there was this other version of Kevin, the one who appeared the moment his family walked through the door. That version went very, very quiet. He smiled more than usual. He agreed with everything. He became, in the most unsettling way, a completely different person. Younger somehow, smaller, like he had stepped back into a role he'd been playing since childhood and had never quite figured out how to leave. His mother, I'll call her what Kevin called her, Mom, though she never once made me feel like I was allowed to, was the kind of woman who expressed love through control. She had opinions on everything, our mortgage rate, the brand of car seat we bought for Ivy, the way I arranged furniture, the fact that I had gone back to work full-time 6 months after Ivy was born. That last one she brought up constantly, in different packaging each time, so it never quite felt like the same conversation. "I just worry about Ivy missing those early years," she'd say, stirring her tea, not quite looking at me. Or, "Kevin was home with me until he started school. I think it made a difference." Or, once, memorably, "It's just different now, isn't it? Everyone's so focused on their careers." I learned early not to respond directly. Responding gave her something to push against. So I would nod, say something vague, and Kevin would either not notice us or pretend not to, and we would move on. That was the system. That was the peace we maintained. His sister's name is Renata. She's 3 years older than Kevin, and her relationship with her mother is built on total agreement. Whatever their mother thinks, Renata thinks. Whatever their mother says, Renata says louder. The two of them together formed a kind of gravitational field, and everyone else in the family. Kevin's father, his uncles, the cousins, orbited quietly without pushing back. Kevin had grown up in that orbit. He didn't even know there was another option. I knew all of this going in. I want to be honest about that. I saw the signs during the engagement, told myself it would settle once we were married, told myself again it would settle once Ivy arrived. It didn't settle, it calcified. The dinner that changed everything happened on a Sunday in October. Thanksgiving weekend. Kevin's parents hosted at their house in Burlington, a 40-minute drive from ours. His aunt and uncle were there, 2 cousins with their families, Renata and her husband and us. 14 people total. Ivy in her portable high chair beside me, eating cut-up pieces of sweet potato and completely unaware that the afternoon was about to become something I would spend months turning over in my mind. I had been up since 6 that morning. Ivy had a rough night, molars coming in, and I'd sat with her in the rocking chair in her room until almost 2 a.m., then woken up again at 5:30 when she called out. I was tired in that particular way that becomes its own kind of weather, something you move through rather than just feel. I had still made a pumpkin loaf to bring. I had still gotten everyone dressed and out the door by noon. I had still smiled when we walked in and the house smelled like roasting turkey. And Kevin's mother looked at the loaf I'd brought and said, "Oh, store-bought?" It was not store-bought. I did not say that. We sat down to eat around 2. The conversation moved the way it always did at these dinners. Kevin's father talking about hockey, the cousins comparing renovation projects. Renata's husband saying very little while. Renata talked enough for both of them. I was cutting Ivy's turkey into smaller pieces and half listening and trying to be present without being tense, which is harder than it sounds when you're in a room where you've never fully felt welcome. Then Kevin's mother looked at my plate. "You're not having stuffing?" I glanced down. I wasn't, because I'd been filling my plate one-handed while managing Ivy and had simply run out of logistics. "I'll get some in a sec," I said. I made it with the recipe Kevin's grandmother always used. She said this to the table more than to me. "He loves it. I'm sure it's wonderful," I said. Renata looked over. "It's basically the only stuffing worth eating, honestly." I smiled and reached over and put some on my plate, and that should have been the end of it. But then Kevin's mother said, still to the general table, still in that conversational tone she used when she wanted to say something pointed without it. Looking pointed. "It's nice when people actually sit down at the table together. As a family. Some families don't do that anymore." There was a small pause. I knew what she meant. Kevin knew what she meant. Everyone probably knew what she meant. I worked 4 days a week at a marketing firm in downtown Toronto. I commuted by GO train. Most weeknights, I got home around 6:30, sometimes 7. Kevin worked from home and picked Ivy up from daycare. It was a system that worked. We had designed it together, but his mother had never approved of the commute, the daycare, any of it, and she found ways to surface that disapproval regularly, always disguised as something general. I kept my voice completely level. "We eat dinner together every night," I said. "Ivy loves it." Kevin's mother gave a small smile. "Of course." Renata set down her fork. "Mom just means it's important. Nobody's criticizing anything, Nora." And that was when something inside me quietly refused. Not loudly. Not with adrenaline or anger, at least not yet. Just a slow, very calm refusal to absorb the thing being said and reshape it into something easier to digest. "I know what she means," I said. "And I'm letting you know that we do sit down together as a family. Every night. So the concern isn't necessary." The table shifted. I felt it before I saw it. That particular change in the air when something has been said that wasn't supposed to be said. Kevin's mother set down her fork too. I was making a general observation. "It didn't feel general," I said. Kevin was sitting to my left. I could see him in my peripheral vision, going very still the way he did when he wanted to disappear from a conversation. Renata turned to look at me fully now. "Can we just have one nice dinner without—" "Without what?" I asked. "Without you making everything into a thing." I felt the flush creep up my neck. Around the table, people were looking at their plates or passing dishes or suddenly very interested in their water glasses. Kevin's uncle cleared his throat. Ivy, bless her, chose that exact moment to hold up a piece of sweet potato toward me like an offering and say, "Mama." And I kissed her hand and felt the sting of tears behind my eyes that I absolutely refused to let happen. "I'm not making anything into a thing," I said quietly. "I'm responding to something that was said." Kevin's mother's voice went soft in that particular way that sounds like hurt, but is actually a very refined form of pressure. "I don't know why there's always so much tension when you're here. When you're here, not when we're here. Me. The tension was mine. The disruption was mine. The fact that a woman had been making small pointed comments for 4 years, and the one time I responded, I was the problem. That framing landed precisely where it was aimed. I looked at Kevin. He looked at his plate, and I thought, there it is. There is the thing I have been trying not to see. After dinner, while the cousins were watching the game in the living room, and Kevin was helping his father in the kitchen, Renata found me in the hallway where I'd gone to change Ivy's diaper. She closed the door partway behind her. "You upset, Mom," she said. "I know. She was just trying to include you in the conversation." I had Ivy on the change pad, focused on what I was doing. By implying I'm not present enough for my own daughter? She didn't say that. She said it without saying it. She does that a lot. I kept my voice even. And I'm sure you know that. Renata crossed her arms. "You've always had a problem with this family." I fastened the diaper tabs and picked Ivy up and turned around. I have a problem with feeling like I need to defend my choices at every family dinner. That's a specific problem. It's not a general attitude. Kevin doesn't feel that way. Kevin grew up here. He knows how to not hear it. I paused. That doesn't mean it isn't there. Renata left without saying anything else. I stood in the hallway for a moment with Ivy on my hip and her warm weight against my side. And I took 3 slow breaths, and I walked back into the living room and sat down and watched the end of the football game and said nothing more about any of it. In the car on the way home, Kevin drove and didn't speak for the first 15 minutes. Then he said, "You could have let it go." "I've been letting it go for 4 years. It was Thanksgiving. I know what day it was." Mom was upset. I turned to look at him. "Kevin." She implied in front of your entire extended family that I'm not present enough for our daughter. And your response is that I could have let it go? He exhaled. She didn't mean it like that. How did she mean it? He didn't answer. We drove the rest of the way in silence. When we got home, I put Ivy to bed, and Kevin watched something on TV. And we went to sleep without really talking, and in the morning he acted like it hadn't happened, and I let him, because I was too tired to do anything else. But something had changed. I could feel it, the way you can feel a change in pressure before a storm. Something had cracked, not in us exactly, but in me. In the part of me that had been accommodating this for years. The weeks that followed were surface-level normal. We went to work, picked up Ivy, made dinner, put her to bed. Kevin was careful with me in the way he got careful after difficult moments. Not apologizing exactly, but being considerate. Filling my coffee before I asked. Texting to say he'd handled dinner. I noticed and appreciated it and also recognized it for what it was, which was a way of moving past without going through. His mother called twice. I let both go to voicemail. She left pleasant messages, one about a recipe, one about a sales at a children's store, that made no reference to Thanksgiving at all, which was its own kind of message. Renata sent a text. It said, "Hope you're doing well. Let me know if you want to grab coffee sometime." As if the hallway conversation had not occurred. As if I had not said, plainly and for the first time in 4 years, what I had been wanting to say. I did not respond. Then, about 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, Kevin came home from his parents' place. He'd taken Ivy over for a Sunday visit while I worked on a project from home. And something in his energy was different. Compressed. Like he'd been holding a conversation in his body the whole drive back. We put Ivy to bed together and came downstairs, and I poured myself a glass of water and waited. He sat at the kitchen table. "Mom wants an apology," he said. I set the glass down. "For what?" "For Thanksgiving." "I'm not going to apologize for responding to something," she said. He rubbed the back of his neck. "She's really hurt, Nora." "Kevin. She called my parenting into question in front of your entire family. She was making conversation. You know that's not what it was." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Can you, just for the sake of everyone, can you just let her feel like she's been heard? She doesn't need a big thing. Just a message. Something that smooths it over. You're asking me to apologize for defending myself. I'm asking you to keep the peace." I looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Ivy's little snores came faintly through the baby monitor on the counter. I thought about all the times I had kept the peace, all the meals I'd sat through, all the implications I'd absorbed, all the times I'd looked at Kevin during some comment or some small cruelty and waited, genuinely waited, for him to say something, and watched him look at his plate instead. "What if I don't?" I said. He looked up. "What? What if I don't apologize?" "What then?" He shifted in his chair. "I don't know, Nora. This whole thing just keeps dragging on, and it's affecting everyone." "What would you do, Kevin?" I kept my voice quiet. Not threatening. Genuinely asking. "If I refuse to apologize for something I didn't do, what happens?" He was quiet for too long, and then he said something I don't think he fully understood the weight of when he said it. He said, "Then maybe you need to sort out what's more important to you, this family or your pride." There it was. I nodded slowly. I said, "Okay." I said it the way you say it when you've just made a decision that the other person doesn't know you've made. Calm. Final. Pointed inward. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, And for the first time in 4 years, I stopped trying to find a version of this situation that could work. I stopped asking what I could do differently. I stopped looking for the angle where everyone came out okay. I thought about Ivy instead, about what I wanted her to understand about herself, about what she was watching her mother do every time I smoothed something over and swallowed something down and smiled when I should have said, no, that was not acceptable. The next morning, Kevin went to the gym early. Ivy was still sleeping. I made coffee and opened my laptop and sent an email to a colleague I'd stayed close with from a previous job. She was a creative director at a mid-size agency in Calgary. We had talked once, about a year ago, about whether I'd ever consider leaving Toronto. I had said probably not. She had said the door was open if that ever changed. I wrote 4 sentences. She replied within 2 hours. The role was still there. It had actually grown. They were rebuilding the team and needed someone with exactly my background. She asked if I could do a call that week. I said yes. The call went well. Then there was a second call with the full team. Then a formal interview, which I did from my car during Ivy's nap time on a Tuesday, parked 2 streets over from our house. 3 days after that, I had an offer letter in my inbox, senior brand strategist. A real salary increase. Benefits that were, objectively, better than what I had now. Calgary, Alberta. I didn't say yes immediately. I spent a week thinking about it in the same way I'd been thinking about everything. Not impulsively, but very, very clearly. I thought about what staying looked like. I thought about what it would take to build a life that felt like mine, not like a negotiation I was always losing. I thought about Ivy in daycare in Calgary, making friends, not knowing that her mother had almost decided to keep quiet forever. I said yes. What followed was 5 weeks of the most focused and exhausting and privately thrilling preparation of my life. I am not someone who is naturally secretive. I find it uncomfortable to hold things back. But I had learned something, finally, that sharing information with people who will use it against you is not honesty. It's just handing them leverage. I contacted a realtor in Calgary, a friend of my colleagues, and found a rental apartment in a neighborhood with a good daycare nearby. I requested a transfer of Ivy's medical records. I researched schools and pediatricians and grocery stores and playgrounds within walking distance of the apartment. I opened a personal checking account. I had one. We both did, in addition to our joint account, and I began quietly redistributing my direct deposits, not taking anything that wasn't mine. Just making sure that what was mine was accessible. I spoke to a family lawyer. I want to say that clearly because it matters. Moving provinces with a child in a marriage is not something you do without understanding the legal landscape. The lawyer was clear. There were steps to take, documents to file, communication to maintain. Kevin would need to be informed. I would need to establish a parenting agreement before or very shortly after relocating. I did everything she told me to do. I did it legally, carefully, and with Ivy's well-being as the organizing question for every single decision. During those 5 weeks, Kevin continued to exist in the version of our marriage where nothing had fundamentally changed. He mentioned his mother occasionally, gently, clearly hoping I'd softened. I hadn't become cold. I was still present, still kind, still putting Ivy to bed with him every night. Still making dinner on the nights that were mine. But I had stopped waiting for him to show up the way I needed him to. That waiting had ended quietly on the night. He asked me to sort out what was more important to me. He came home once with flowers, yellow tulips, which he knew I liked. He set them in the vase on the kitchen island and said, and I said, I agree, and I put the kettle on. And we talked about Ivy's new daycare room and the neighbor's renovation, and whether we should finally get the eavestro looked at before winter, and he seemed relieved. The way people seem relieved when they think a storm has passed. The night before I'd arranged for movers to come. I had scheduled them for a day. Kevin had a dentist appointment and a long-standing lunch with a friend, a window I knew would give me enough time. I sat at the kitchen table after Ivy was in bed and I wrote Kevin a letter. It wasn't cruel. I want to be clear about that. I have no interest in cruelty. But it was honest in a way that I had never been fully honest with him, because I had always been editing myself to manage his comfort and his family's feelings, and I was done doing that. I told him that I had accepted a job in Calgary, that Ivy and I were leaving in the morning, that I had spoken to a lawyer and understood my obligations and his rights, and that I intended to co-parent respectfully and make space for his relationship with Ivy in every way I reasonably could. I told him the name of my lawyer, so he could contact her directly. I told him I was not doing this out of anger, and that was true. I was past anger by then, but out of a need to build a life where I wasn't constantly shrinking to fit into a space that had never been designed with me in mind. And I told him the one thing I needed him to understand, that the moment he asked me to choose between my dignity and his family's comfort, the choice had already been made. I just hadn't said it out loud yet. I left the letter on the kitchen table under his keys. The drive to the airport the next morning was the first time in years I felt like I could breathe without calculating whether the breath was taking up too much space. Ivy sat in her car seat talking to her stuffed elephant and asking questions about clouds, and I answered every one of them. We checked our bags. We went through security. I bought her a blueberry muffin at a cafe near the gate, and she ate it with the focused dedication of someone for whom a blueberry muffin is a serious matter. And I sat beside her and thought, this is already better. We haven't even left yet, and this is already better. My phone started vibrating somewhere over northern Ontario. Kevin had found the letter. I let the calls go. I watched the call log fill up. Kevin, then a number I recognized as his mother's, then Kevin again. I turned the phone face down on my tray table and looked out the window at the cloud cover below us and thought about nothing in particular. When we were closer to Calgary, I turned the phone back over. I answered when Kevin called again. Nora. His voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Not angry. Stripped of something. Hi. You actually did this. Yes. You took our daughter to another province. I did. I also contacted a lawyer and sent you her information and outlined the parenting plan I'd like to work toward. Everything's in the letter. Silence. Nora, I don't even know what this is. It's me making a decision, I said. Like you asked me to. He didn't say anything for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. I didn't think you actually would. I know. I looked out the window again. The Rockies were coming into view, jagged and white at the peaks, and I had not seen them in years. That's the thing about ultimatums, Kevin. Sometimes the person accepts them. The silence that followed lasted almost a full minute. Then, what do I do now? It was, I realized, the most honest question he had ever asked me. Call your lawyer first, I said. Then call mine. Then, when you're ready, call me. Not about the logistics. Not about what your mother thinks, just to talk. As two people who are going to be raising Ivy together for the next 16 years, he didn't respond right away. I heard him exhale. I'm sorry, he said. I waited to feel something. Relief, satisfaction, the particular release of finally hearing the thing you'd needed to hear. What I felt instead was something quieter. Not closure, exactly. More like the beginning of something that might, over time, become okay. I know, I said. We'll talk more soon. I hung up and looked at Ivy, who had fallen asleep against her armrest with her elephant tucked under one arm, and I let myself sit in the quiet for a while. Calgary was overcast when we landed. The mountains were invisible behind the clouds, just a gray-white mass where the sky ended. The woman at the rental car desk asked if it was our first time in the city, and I said no. I used to come for work, but this time we were staying. She said, "Welcome home," the way people say things when they don't really mean anything by it, and I thought, actually yes. Thank you. The apartment was smaller than our house in Oakville. The kitchen had a slightly awkward layout, and one of the bedroom closets had a door that didn't quite close all the way. The daycare down the street had a butterfly mural on the front window. The grocery store 2 blocks over had a good produce section, and the man at the cheese counter gave Ivy a small piece of cheddar to taste, and she accepted it with great seriousness, and then said, "More, please." And he laughed and gave her another piece, and I thought, she is going to be completely fine. She was, and she is. The months that followed were not simple. Co-parenting across provinces is logistics heavy and emotionally complicated and requires a level of consistent communication with someone you're also quietly grieving. Kevin flew out the first time about 6 weeks after we arrived. He took Ivy to a park and a museum and stayed in a hotel nearby, and I sat in the apartment and didn't know what to do with the quietness. When he dropped her off that evening, she was overstimulated and clingy and cried when he left, and I held her and thought, this is the cost. This is real. I had chosen this with full knowledge that it would be hard, and it was hard, and I did not pretend otherwise. But something remarkable was happening underneath the difficulty. Ivy was thriving. She settled into her new daycare within 2 weeks, faster than I'd expected. She made a best friend named Zara who had a gap in her front teeth and strong opinions about which playground equipment was worth using. She started sleeping better, longer, more peacefully, and I didn't know exactly what to attribute that to. New place, new routine, reduced tension in her home environment. But I had a feeling it was all three. And I don't want to overstate this. I was becoming myself again, not a dramatic transformation. Not suddenly fearless or unhurt. Just the slow, quiet return of knowing what I thought about things without checking whether thinking it was going to cause a problem. Of expressing a preference without bracing for the reframe. Of being in a room without managing how much space I took up. Kevin and I had hard conversations over the following months. Real ones, the kind we had never quite managed to have when we were in the same house with his family's orbit close by. He told me things I hadn't known. That he had been aware, for a long time, that something was wrong. That he had told himself it wasn't as bad as I experienced it. That watching me finally leave had been the first time he'd understood that his silence had not been neutral. It had been a choice. He had been choosing his family's comfort over my dignity every single time he looked at his plate. He said this plainly and without excusing it, and I respected him for that. His mother called me once, about 4 months in. A real call, not a polite voicemail. She was stiff at first, formal in the way people get when they know they're doing something difficult and they haven't prepared well enough for it. Then she said, I don't think I understood what I was doing. She said it like a confession, like it cost her something. I thought I was just being involved. I didn't understand that involved can feel like intrusion. I didn't rush to reassure her. I let it sit there for a moment, the way it deserved to sit. Thank you for saying that, I said, and I meant it. Renata has not called. I don't expect her to, and I've made a kind of peace with that. Some people are not capable of seeing their own behavior clearly, and deciding to make yourself miserable waiting for them to do so is a form of self-harm I am no longer interested in. Kevin and I are not together. I want to be honest about that. We are not one of those stories where distance creates clarity and everyone comes back together stronger. The marriage ended. We filed. We negotiated. We both cried at different moments during different phone calls and eventually signed papers and became something new. Two people who share a daughter and are, now genuinely trying to do that well. He is a good father. He comes to Calgary every 6 weeks. Ivy goes to him for school breaks. She is 4 now, and she knows that Daddy lives in a different city and Mummy lives here, and that both cities have good playgrounds and that she is loved wherever she is. She said to me once, out of nowhere, while we were drawing at the kitchen table, Mummy, are you happy here? And I told her yes, and she considered this very carefully the way she considers most things, and then went back to her drawing. She had colored the sky purple. I didn't correct her. There's something I think about sometimes. In the mornings before Ivy wakes up, when the apartment is still and the light comes through the kitchen window at a low angle, and everything is quiet in a way that still surprises me with its gentleness. I think about the Thanksgiving dinner. I think about the moment Kevin said, "Sort out what's more important to you." He meant it as a warning. He meant it to remind me what I stood to lose. What he didn't understand, what none of them understood, is that some of us have spent so long managing other people's feelings that we forget we're allowed to have our own. that when someone finally gives us a clear choice, we take it not out of anger, but out of recognition. Finally, here is the exit. Here is the door I've been looking for. He thought he was threatening me with loss. He was showing me the way out. And the morning I walked through it, with Ivy on my hip and 2 suitcases and a one-way ticket to Calgary, was the first morning in 4 years that felt entirely, unambiguously mine.